Alright, y'all, so today I want to talk about one of the craziest pieces of rock and roll history that you probably will ever hear of. A story that honestly is too good to be true, but in this case really did happen. Of course, I'm going to be talking about the time where multi-millionaire, gold record selling, massive, producer, musical innovator Brian Wilson, of course, Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys, a time in the late 60s to very early 70s, opened a health food store located in West Hollywood, a store that was named the Radiant Radish. Just kind of like one of those stories, like I said before, it just sounds too good to be true, but it really did happen. A store, where you have a multi-millionaire and he just casually runs a health food store. I thought this topic was so fascinating and so interesting. The fact that this really did happen, I just kind of wanted to make a video about it and just give you my thoughts on it. So in this video, I'm going to talk about the Radiant Radish, the history of it, at least most of the known experiences that happened in it, why it never, it got canceled, if you will, it shut down, and the ultimate legacy and my personal opinions on this wild part of Beach Boys history, the Radiant Radish. So regardless, let's jump into this, I guess. Now, the store was opened in 1969, but to get the full context of this, we got to go before 1969. Brian Wilson at this point was still kind of the de facto leader of the Beach Boys. He was producing records, sold millions of records, created some generational hits. Obviously, he released in 1966 Good Vibrations. And, he was starting to work on his next album, the very legendary Smile. And this is really where you start to see Brian's obsession with healthy eating, health, fitness, really just start to take a predominant role in song structure and lyrical content of his songs that he was starting to develop, at least some of the new songs that he was working on. Songs like, I'm in a great shape, and of course the more predominant Vegetables, which if you've never heard of it, it was a 1967 song that was intended for Smile, and it's all about eating vegetables. It literally also has people eating vegetables, the sounds of them eating vegetables in the songs itself. Obviously, famously, Paul McCartney apparently eating a piece of celery in the track. So take that as you will. Now, the song was originally supposed to be releasing as a single for Smile before it got scrapped. And a part of that, release of the single, there was a photo shoot, if you will, at Los Angeles Farmers Market where Brian posed in front of a vegetable food stand in preparation for the single getting released. And, like I said before, that was one of the big things. He started to be obsessed with healthy eating. He started to be obsessed with talking about it, putting it into his songs. And it was painfully ironic just because Brian's actual lifestyle was kind of the opposite of that. He would eat very unhealthy. He would gain a lot of weight. He just kind of wanted everyone else to exercise, so to speak. But this is one of those weird things that Brian became very obsessed with. He even put fitness mats in his house at one point to allow his entourage to roll around and exercise and stuff. But of course, he wouldn't do anything. He just wanted to watch. But yeah, that was kind of one of the things. He had this obsession with healthy eating. And, he was also going through a lot of mental health struggles. I believe in 1968, he was admitted into a mental health institution, and he was going through a lot of struggles. Creatively, he was starting to take a step back from the Beach Boys. He wasn't, as prominent of a producer and leader as he was during the Pet Sounds and Smile eras of the band. And Brian was looking for a new thing, a new outlet, if you will, to distract himself from all the stresses of being in the Beach Boys, personal life. And he decided, in terms of, collaboration, he got together with his cousin at the time, Steve Kornhoff, and his friend Arnie Geller, and basically put down and financed and opened up a small health food store, which was located at the corner of Melrose Avenue and St. Vicente Boulevard in West Hollywood, California. starting at the basically in 1969 with about $15,000, opened up a small health food shop, which I believe $15,000 would be roughly $130 to $132,000 today in like 2026 dollars at the time I'm making this video. But yeah, it's pretty interesting stuff. And he opened up this store, and yeah, that's what happened. And he named it the Radiant Radish. And it had a lot of typical, health food. Now, in terms of the actual contents, there's not much extremely to be said about this. That being said, in terms of the actual design, it had a Radiant Radish logo in front of the store, as you can see for the image I selected for this video. A health food sign. Mainly had a glass exterior with signs, kind of advertising the various fruits and deals. And I gotta say, for a health food store, the Radiant Radish, that is an awesome name for a health food store. I mean, a lot of health food stores kind of have very generic names. The Radiant Radish, I would totally go inside that store. That's really, really cool. Now, in terms of the actual layout, it was pretty basic. It opened up in 1969. There was kind of like to the right when you went in, there was like a little bit of like a, cash register and a stand there to basically get your items and leave. Everything was laid out like a typical health food store. The vegetables are laid out. The bottles are all lined through shelves. One thing people do mention is that there weren't really any kind of lighting directly on the food or like directly near certain aspects of the shelves and the vitamins. Everything was lit with fluorescent bulbs above in the roof. So it kind of created darkness on certain things and made certain things hard to see on certain shelves. But yeah, that's pretty much it. If you can look at some of the photos online, that's pretty much how it was. Now, let's get into the actual operations of the store, because this is really where it becomes really, really interesting. Now, the main day-to-day operations of the store when it opened up in 1969 were mainly ran by Geller and Korshoff. Brian wasn't necessarily predominantly there. But it was also, it seemed to be at his whim when the store would actually be open. Because one of the things about the Radiant Radish it became very famous for is it had very irregular hours. Sometimes the store would be open up at midnight. Sometimes it would be open at 6 p.m. in the afternoon. It was kind of mainly at Brian's whim. And it's one of the weirdest things. Brian would just open the store whenever he felt like it. Mainly at night, apparently. So can you imagine this? If you want your, last minute, midnight, maybe if you're high munchies snack and you want to go to a health food store, there's a chance the Radiant Radish would have been opened up in West Hollywood in 1969, and you could have got your stuff there. It's just one of the weirdest things. Adding to that, Brian's appearance. He would just show up to the store in his pajamas most of the time. He would show up in his pajamas, a bathrobe, and slippers. And he mainly just sat behind the counter and operated the cash register, which years later he would state was the funnest thing that he learned when he was operating the store. And he apparently learned it from his day-to-day operating people like Geller. So it's just kind of one of those things that's really, really interesting. He also would occasionally show up at the store and just kind of, take some of the stock of the store, sometimes roughly $9,000 worth in today's dollars worth of stocks. And this would include juices and vegetables and all kinds of sorts of items and stuff. Like I said before, the store sold a variety of vegetables, vitamins, medicines, even cookies and treats. But Brian would just show up and take some of the store stock for himself, which, I guess in that case, since he basically helped create it, I guess he's entitled to, but still really, really strange nonetheless. But yeah, he sometimes would operate and sit behind the counter if the other two partners weren't there, and the store had really irregular hours, and Brian would mainly be in his bathrobe and slippers running the store, which is, like I said, just one of those strangest sights to see. Can you imagine at 1 a.m. in the morning getting carrots with a Brian Wilson behind the counter? I can't imagine that. It's crazy. There's also really kind of a crazy moment, if you will, that happened in 1969 that kind of kind of exemplified this whole experience of the Radiant Radish, and that is mainly from journalist Tom Nolan. Now, he wrote a piece about the Beach Boys. He had apparently seen a very morbid film and decided that he heard a little bit about the Radiant Radish in 1969 and decided to go and check it out. And this was like really late at night, and basically, he was walking around the store getting stuff and eventually picked a vitamin bottle by the name of B12 and he wanted to buy it. Basically, I think what happened was he apparently handed Brian the bottle of B12, and Brian said, and this is kind of coming from the article for the most part, what you want is a B complex. And he ran his, basically he ran his fingers over a row of bottles seeking just the right supplement. Did you get a call for B12? And I said, a call? And Brian said, from your doctor. If you got a call, I said no. Well, no. And then Brian said, well, now, unless there's a call, you can't. And basically, he would not sell him the vitamin bottle. Basically stating that he would not sell him the vitamin of B12 without a prescription. Which is, like I said, one of the strangest things to note. I'm not exactly sure how vitamins and prescriptions worked back in the 60s, but at least in today's world, most of the time, you can just buy as many vitamins as you want without a prescription. And I mean, I guess it must have been unusual enough for Tom Nolan to mention in his article, because it's just kind of one of those extremely strange things, which, according to his article, if you actually read it, he thought that the appearance of Brian Wilson running a health food store was probably the most strangest thing of all, beyond, of course, him in the bathroom at midnight running a health food store. But yeah, that's one of the more famous incidents that happened during this store. This whole, this very short-lived experience. This journalist trying to buy a bottle of vitamins, and Brian saying he can't have this without a doctor's note. It's just one of those, really strange things that, it's just wild to think about. I mean, it's just, imagine that today, you can, vitamins are typically things you can buy without a prescription. So, not sure what Brian's on about, but then again, it was 1969, so pretty strange stuff. And, the store would continue very briefly in terms of operations. It would open up for regular hours. Celebrities apparently would sometimes show up, but it's just kind of like one of those things. And, it seemed like the whole experience, and this has been described by journalists and even Brian himself, it just felt like an escape for Brian. He was going through a lot of stresses, and the idea of him running this very standard health food store kind of almost resembled what most people would experience in their normal lives, like an almost normal life experience of just getting a job and working in a store. And which, I think is extremely profound, considering the fact that Brian, from a very young age became really famous, really wealthy, and was a mega rock star due to the early success of the Beach Boys. And, running this health food store, even at, these really strange irregular hours, and the whole experience being quite strange, was probably pretty comforting to him, just because it allowed him to do something that at least resembled something normal. So, take that with you as you will. But yeah, still really interesting stuff. And there's also some other things. He had apparently met the journalist and radio presenter Jack Riley at the store, who, if you know anything about Beach Boys history, he would eventually become the manager of the Beach Boys and occasional vocalist on some of their albums, and apparently Wilson's principal lyricist for this period of time. And, he was involved with the band and really led to the creation of Surf's Up, their album in 1971, and then eventually Holland, before he was let go from the band. But it's kind of crazy. Jack Riley met Brian at this very short-lived health food store that Brian ran called the Radiant Radish. Kind of one of the weirdest things, right? Now, in terms of the actual closure date, there are various things and dates of when the store possibly could have closed, and this is where the mystery of the Radiant Radish gets a little bit confusing. The typical narrative is that it most likely went defunct and went bankrupt and closed its doors in July 29th of 1970. So at some point it could have closed down in 1970, but there are also other people that state that the store lived a little bit longer. Some people claim that it was, its doors were still open in 1971, and some people even, stretching it and claiming that there was apparently reports of it open in 1972, which I highly doubt. Now, why did this, why, of course, did this store close down? Well, if you didn't know by some of the hints I was giving in this video, the reason why it closed down is because Brian kind of summed it up in his memoir, but he basically stated that they had, bought a lot of produce and put a lot of money in help setting up the store, and there just wasn't really a lot of return for it coming in. There was not a lot of people coming in and buying things. There wasn't really a lot of revenue and profit, and eventually they had to declare bankruptcy and the store had to close. So yeah, that's mainly the reason why the Radiant Radish that Brian Wilson led closed down. Mainly just because people, there really weren't enough people going there, and it wasn't really generating any kind of profit, and they had to declare bankruptcy. And like I said, there's some contradictory reports of how long it was open. Some people state that it was 1970. Some people say 1971 or 72. My personal opinion is it was most likely 69 to 1970, but that's my, prediction, if you will. Now, to talk a little bit about the legacy of the Radiant Radish, it's obviously one of those things that's talked about a lot in Beach Boys history and subreddits. It was famously mentioned in an unreleased song called, I think what's kind of Help Is On The Way, which was a song that was done and primarily written and arranged by Brian Wilson and Mike Love sang. And it's basically a song similar to Vegetables. It's all about healthy eating and throwing out bad foods. But one of the things I mentioned about this song, and kind of one of the funny things about it, is Mike Love name drops the Radiant Radish at the end of it. Basically, if you will, today's version of a plug. They name dropped the Radiant Radish. And that was kind of an unreleased song that was basically worked on in 1970. So, that's kind of one of the funny things about the legacy of the store. It also was put on some merchandise and T-shirts by the Beach Boys. Brian has spoken about it. And I think there was like a compilation or like an anthology of the Beach Boys that featured like a variant of it that, was kind of, based on the Radiant Radish. And it's just kind of a crazy story, if you will, of kind of a crazy narrative, if you will. But yeah, to kind of quickly wrap up this video and quit all the rambling that I'm doing, that's mainly the story of this really odd period of time that legendary producer, singer, songwriter Brian Wilson ran a small health food store in West Hollywood. And, its brief period of time, its legacy, and how it's remembered in Beach Boys history. Pretty crazy. There's also a weird thing, too, about the Radiant Radish, at least the place that was located. It obviously closed down and was used by various, outlets and stores over the years. But I believe it was also host to, I think, Drake's liquor brand, if you will. So that's a really eerie coincidence. Another celebrity owned a store in a spot where another celebrity owned it. It's kind of, at one point, it's kind of like one of those really crazy coincidences. But yeah, that's my thoughts on the Radiant Radish, one of the crazy stories revolving around the Beach Boys. Hopefully you have a good day, and peace, y'all.